Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending the first installment of our Corona Correction webcast series, Is Your Supply Chain Dynamic Enough to Handle COVID-19? My name is Karen Rines, and I'm the Americas Marketing Manager for the Risk Business at Refinitiv. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, some technical points. There is no dial-in number for the audio. Please use your device's sound and plug in your headphones to listen to this webinar. Click on the media player on your screen to enable the sound and ensure that Flash is enabled on your browser. If the slides get stuck during the presentation, please refresh your browser. Usually this will unfreeze them. At the bottom of your audience console screen, you'll see a toolbar with multiple widgets. If you have any technical difficulty during the webcast, please click the Help widget, which is the yellow question mark icon. This covers common technical issues. You can expand your slide window by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right of the slide box or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide box to expand. At the top right corner of your audience console is the Q&A chat box. Please submit your questions in this box. Our presenters will try to answer as many questions as they can during the last 5 to 10 minutes of the webcast. And if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, we'll also be answering questions later via email. We do capture all questions. Finally, the link to the recorded webcast, a copy of the slides, and other resources will be emailed to you after the conclusion of the event. You may also access the webcast on demand using the same audience link that you used today. Before I introduce today's panelists, we'd like to learn a little bit about what industry you work in. So if you wouldn't mind, please use your cursor. Just click on the poll question that appears on your screen and click Submit. I'll give you a few seconds to answer the question. Okay, great. Looks like a number of different industries are represented today, but wow, overwhelmingly financial services. So I'm sure our speakers will be addressing many issues to various people, but especially financial. We have a lot to cover today, so let's get on with the introduction. Charmaine Simmons is a Performance and Strategy Director at Refinitiv and brings over 20 years of practitioner experience from her time in internal audits at Morgan Stanley, Lloyd's Banking Corp, and also in IT advisory at PwC. Charmaine is CISA, CRMA, and CAM certified and leverages that knowledge in engaging with the C-suite and compliance, operational, IT, and audit professionals. Nick Bellani is Enhanced Due Diligence Transformation Manager at Refinitiv. Most recently, he was Director of Business Intelligence at the Risk Assistance Network and Exchange, a network-based risk intelligence firm where he led the production of customized research to support client inquiries, primarily focused on non-financial transactional due diligence analysis within the multinational corporate and private equity space. And Linda Rogers has been with Pentair for 21 years in a variety of roles from accounting and payroll to purchasing compliance, including Sarbanes-Oxley process implementation. She currently manages the global compliance team at Pentair and is focused on international trade compliance and anti-corruption programs. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Charmaine to get started. Charmaine?
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. It's really great to see so many industry groups represented on the webinar today, so welcome. Let's start today by talking about the current situation. I think, week after week, the headlines and the news reports are all telling us that things are going from bad to worse. We're seeing globally, that being a huge impact, but in particular here in the US, where New York is really the epicenter for the US. I think the biggest part of COVID right now is really the human and the emotional element that's really so difficult for us all to process. And we're seeing things like unemployment rising by the day. We're seeing uncertainty in many industries, and now even the health and the safety is really sort of the top of everybody's mind. And I think the supply chain has really been heavily impacted with a mass level of disruption. Some would say that COVID is sort of a wake-up call for supply chain management right now. The effect of COVID is obviously profound. We are really and truly in unprecedented times in terms of disruption, but also in terms of duration. We're seeing right now a stat from yesterday, over 1.2 million confirmed cases of COVID. We've got over 70,000 deaths and around 250,000 that have actually recovered from contracting COVID right now. The unpredictability of COVID means we see variability in the trends of the transmission, things like different locational approaches and responses. And these responses are even varying as it comes from different governments around the world, whether that be on the economic conditions of things, on the public health system, and also how they're mitigating those particular risks that are particular to each country or each state, and how they're looking to obviously flatten the curve. Now, at the end, we may not see that the end is really near, but we're also in that I guess that stage of not knowing about what's happening with COVID right now to look and think about the seasonality aspect of it. So COVID could very easily have a reoccurrence. And that sort of new normal might be that we're operating here, might be here for a little while still. But I guess one question to sort of sit back and ask ourselves, knowing that we're in this state of disruption, is have we actually been here before? So if we were just to take a little bit of a stroll down memory lane, over the past 2 decades, we've seen a host of different events, whether they're viral sort of infections or natural disasters, and they've all led to varying degrees of disruption. So let's take, for example, Hurricane Harvey in Texas in 2017, which impacted crude oil and gas production and prices. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So it does to me. Or let's go back even further. In 2011, the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, which halted manufacturing for a long time and impacted a lot of distribution channels in and out of the Asia region. And even coronaviruses of the past, such as MERS in 2012 or SARS in the early 2000s, really and truly impacted many individuals' health. It impacted manufacturing, it impacted export in many, many countries around the world. So looking at these sort of past events and things, Nick, I'd love to get your perspective on this. How is COVID-19 affecting the supply chain today?
Thanks, Charmaine. In terms of how it's affecting supply chain today, obviously this is unprecedented. We've had previous disruptions, as Charmaine just reflected upon, that were geopolitical in nature, that were natural disasters, that were man-made more so in terms of cyber attacks, but also biological epidemics. Obviously, COVID is unprecedented on the scale and on the size of disruption it is causing. Our current situation, the disruption that's already occurred, that's already here. As you can see on this slide ahead of us, the supply chain disruption has occurred. There's limited capacity in production. There's limited capacity in terms of distribution channels. Now, this obviously immediately resulted in the activation of business continuity plans and amending supply chain procurement processes so enterprises could try to adjust to the best of their ability to maintain some sort of reasonable continuity of operations. The second step in terms of the current situation, or the next impact, was the demand surges and supply shortages around medical and consumer essentials. The other side of that, in kind of a mutually beneficial, or not mutually beneficial, but zero-sum scenario, is the demand dropping for non-essential products, services, and industries. This has resulted in quick pivots to new unfamiliar partners in terms of supplying and manufacturing, maintain continuity for those more essential companies, as well as other companies that were seemingly non-essential, pivoting to and repurposing their manufacturing to become an essential industry and to help the current situation, assist the current situation in any way possible. Obviously, within this, we saw workforce reductions via quarantine, via enterprises protecting their personnel, which has affected both supply and demand side, which has also resulted in expansive unemployment, unfortunately, or repurposing certain folks to different employment roles. But within these 4 specific points of our current situation, they resulted in kind of elevated private market competition within supply chain for essential products and services and industries, as we've seen all over the news with PPE, and just actually related to, I'm going to get to the next point with now people discussing certain kind of protectionist mentalities around food, which leads me to the economic shifts overall in commercial, competitive, and regulatory environments. With the elevated private marketplace competition and the shortages and the rise of demands in sectors that weren't necessarily anticipating this kind of elevated market, we have government intervention. We have government protectionism, regionalism for the essential products, services, and industries. The protectionism was probably most evident with PPE over the last few news cycles, which seems like an hourly news cycle at this point, specifically referring to India decided to ban exports of certain medicines. The United States tried to apply pressure to 3M to inhibit exporting face masks. More than a few countries in the UK and the EU also had applied similar pressure to private enterprises around PPE, and certain countries have taken similar measures and export bans around food production and export. So obviously it's kind of changing the environment, and it's causing these shifts in commercial, competitive, and the regulatory environment in general, especially for private enterprises and how the governments are now kind of interjecting themselves in this situation.
Great, thanks, Nick. I mean, definitely that macro and that micro side is an important area to understand. Linda, I'm really sort of curious on your part. Obviously, with Pentair, you have quite a big, supply chain. So how is Pentair handling the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, Pentair has approximately 15,000 suppliers and really close, roughly the same amount of resellers, either distributors or OEMs or wholesalers or DIY stores, in addition to direct end user base. So for us, we have a continuous process of enterprise risk management where we continually monitor world events, transportation strikes, global political situations, environmental concerns, and more, which allow us to keep our business continuity plan up to date. In the COVID-19 situation, our 3 manufacturing sites in China and our Shanghai office opened the thought process on how we were going to handle this. It was a very limited scale to what was needed once the situation became global, but we had learned a lot from them. We had to quickly get supplies We had to quickly get supplies to them that they were unable to purchase there. So we were looking at how do we ship sanitizer wipes to them? How do we get things like that they needed, alcohol swabs and face masks? And in turn, we quickly had to find new transportation modes to move our production from there to other sites. We had a bit of a benefit since we increased our on-hand levels globally because of the Chinese New Year. The teams quickly adapted to working from home, and in turn, we tried to absorb the additional work with the remaining staff around the world. When the situation expanded around the globe, we took the work and the communication plans that we had used for China on the smaller scale basis, and we introduced the same process globally. We have been very successful as a compliance team in maintaining all of our existing processes, but thankfully we have so much of our screening and investigative system automated that it seemed rather seamless to us. In relation to procurement, we have implemented a lot of dual source critical goods in the past.
No, that sounds great, Linda. I'm really pleased to see that there's an element of, you being on top of this and having, looked at what's happened in the past and, like you said, what's happened with sort of the China supply side. But do you think there's any sort of other lessons learned from some of those past events that I mentioned a little bit earlier, either for Pentair or just in general for some of the industries and your peers?
Well, I think at Pentair there's a really strong enterprise risk management team that's constantly what we look at. We're consistently looking at world events and the news media, right, that help shape not only the way we source but the way we sell. We are truly a global company, so we work hard to ensure that our global customers have more than one manufacturing site to rely on. In case one goes down, almost always there's another one that can manufacture the exact same good.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you. I'm just going to pivot away from that sort of a topic of, how we've really been impacted right now. Many of us are obviously working from home, and we're still carrying out all of our usual remits and our responsibilities to the best of our ability. So perhaps, Nick, I can direct this question over to you. If we're working in what I'm going to call our new normal or our virtual office environment, a lot of us are working under a business continuity plan of some type, whether it's a full plan or just a partial implementation. Majority of us are. And could you help us sort of understand if there's any considerations or revisions that compliance and procurement teams should be thinking about regarding their supply chain? And is there any sort of a regulatory impact or adherence side that we should really be thinking about?
Absolutely. So there's two kind of I would say, mutually exclusive considerations in terms of considering our relative new normal. So obviously we should be considering our business continuity plan and the revision of our kind of supply chain process, or kind of getting our overall holistic view. Unfortunately, this disruption, as big as it is, has kind of exposed the fact that a lot of BCPs are somewhat reactive in nature, and obviously will ideally be revised after this process to be more adaptable, as we'll get into later in this webinar. Anyhow, in terms of the BCP kind of supply chain revision, we need to be extra cognizant of the globalization and growing complexity of supply chains, and start really taking into consideration the cross-border vulnerability risk, the jurisdictional risk, the geographical and regional risk. As we spoke about briefly earlier with disruptions, they're not only geopolitical in nature. Obviously, there's cross-border vulnerabilities with a biological epidemic like this, or a natural disaster, or even some kind of man-made aspect of things. Obviously, with our BCPs and supply chain procurement processes, the scale of unpredictability is there, as is evident with our current situation, and we need to get away from being reactive. But while we're doing this, and while when we're activating our BCPs, and we're looking to potentially pivot our supply chains and suppliers, we need to also be cognizant of the regulatory compliance continuity. We need to make sure that in spite of these external pressures, which, as we all know, are very pressing external pressures to maintain a continuity of our enterprise, to kind of pivot to either, help the cause if we're not, if we're an essential business. We need to make sure we have consistent implementation of a risk-based compliance program specific to bribery, corruption, especially in these times of disruption. On top of that, we also, within the BCP, there should also be regulatory guidance around documented policies and procedures for succession reporting, and the escalation to the appropriate individuals with committee approval, the appropriate individual with the proper roles and responsibilities. So to walk that back a little bit, we still have to be extra cognizant of FCPA related matters, our compliance and regulatory procedures, to make sure that we're properly looking at our suppliers, our vendors, making sure we're assessing any sort of risk dependent upon what regulatory obligation we're subject to, and to make sure there's a documentation trail around this, or an audit trail, that when we are in a situation when we are pressed for time, we are working from virtual office environment, that we know the proper succession chain and the proper individuals to go to sign off, to make sure we're within our kind of risk appetite for our compliance regulatory thresholds.
Thanks, Nick. You do mention FCPA there and what's happening under sort of anti-bribery and anti-corruption, and I think that's a really important one to bear in mind, particularly as it relates to the supply chain. Linda, I know your responsibilities at Pentair has certainly been around sort of FCPA and anti-bribery and anti-corruption. So what sort of trends or actions are you seeing in the market currently? And is there anything in particular that your team is doing differently because of operating under a BCP or operating, in this COVID-19 environment?
Well, thanks for asking. If you're in compliance, you're seeing warnings from all of the various government agencies and firms advising about the increased risk for opportunities for corruption, including the DOJ and the FTC statement on March 24th regarding COVID-19, right? So they already brought out and said, you got to stay on the clean and narrow. So I think we'll see many fines probably related to violations that occur today once the violations that are occurring today once the pandemic is over. I don't think you'll probably see it in process now, but I think there'll be some repercussions that come out later on. Typically, manufacturing businesses historically did not keep an abundance of inventory, and they operated in a very streamlined culture so that they were delivering right on time. With this pandemic, everything became a rush. So with COVID-19, businesses are rushing to move their shipments before transportation or borders are shut down. They're pushing their suppliers to get more components or finished goods before the supplier has logistic or virus concerns. And they're rushed to get new suppliers because the previous one is locked in a lockdown country or is unable to produce what they need. So we're pushing to make sales from home offices instead of visiting potential customers to better understand what those customer operations look like. And these new challenges are definitely increasing risk. Companies are still trying to make financial commitments. It's a more difficult challenge due to the uncertainty that they're facing. Countries are actually changing requirements on import and export of personal protection equipment, which is another risk, as this equipment is highly needed and desired and could be on the move in the air as the country changes the requirements. It could arrive missing needed certificates to be imported, which is another opportunity for corruption both on import and export. The Pentair compliance team is meeting as a whole a couple times a week, right? At least twice a week. We are talking about these subjects. We're discussing with eyes open and we ask questions. Our management top down is conveying our principles, along with the concern for the employee's health. They're talking about our principles so that we make sure that we keep that on the forefront for our employees. My team is also meeting with regional ops and sales leaders to ensure that we're reminding them locally of policies and procedures and no shortcuts. We also talk about our high-risk areas and the bare minimums that might be needed in a low-risk area. We want to make sure that we aren't forgetting compliance through all of the chaos that we're facing today. I can tell you personally, my email traffic and communications between the regions are so much higher. Everyone is looking so much closer at individual potential sales and movement of goods. So I think for us, we see more, right? We're seeing way more than we used to because everything is rushed, and so people are double checking their questions, which is a good thing for Pentair.
No, most certainly that sort of double checking aspect is, I think, an important aspect just to make sure that we're not overlooking or becoming a little bit complacent when it comes to anything to do with that regulatory side of it. And I really like, even on the slides you put here, the bad guys are not gone. Can you just comment on what you specifically mean by that statement?
There are people out there that are out to make money, right? So they're going to try to act corrupt. I mean, the criminals didn't all disappear just because of Corona, I guess is what I'm saying. So it's just one of those awareness. It's still there. There's still people that are willing to be corrupt, and we just have to keep our programs good in a good place.
Yeah, I think I wholeheartedly agree with you there. I think those that are in that sort of criminal activity, they're certainly not stopping their enterprises now just because everybody's working at home. I think, if anything, they're probably ramping those up, knowing that there's more of a vulnerability for how we can actually sit there and take that on. So I think that just is a bit of a great reminder for everybody to be a little bit more mindful over what you're doing, and just bear in mind that, from this perspective, there is no defense against, COVID-19 in this state of corruption. So thank you for those comments. But Karen, I know we have a polling question coming up.
Yes, we do. Audience, here's our next question for you. Do you believe your supply chain is dynamic enough to handle the implications of COVID-19? If you take a moment and answer, click submit, and we'll look at the results in about 5 seconds here. Okay, Charmaine, here's our results. What's your take on it?
Great, thank you. I'm going to sit there and say I'm actually pleasantly surprised. The mostly answer is what I would have expected majority of people to have answered. So that does sort of align back with we are operating in a different environment, but it also is important to realize that there are changes going on, and we do need to be cognizant of any improvements or any changes that we make. How do we take those forward to obviously better a program overall? So I'm also very pleasantly surprised. About 24% of people are saying that they are well prepared and they are functioning in a normal case as if nothing had happened. So that's very, very reassuring, I think, to all of our audiences. But I think that the best part of why you really asked that question, Karen, up front to everybody is, obviously having a dynamic supply chain is really important right now. We're seeing it in so many different levels of multiple industries that have been highly sort of impacted and disrupted, particularly those in sort of manufacturing, more raw materials. We're seeing things in oil and gas, healthcare and pharmaceuticals, obviously. But, right now we're also seeing that heavy reliance on suppliers and distributors, particularly those that have been out of China with the COVID-19 situation starting there and obviously closing down a lot of factories and things. And while they may have started to go back to that and they've reopened the borders, that's obviously going to start to pose a little bit more of a challenge for everybody going forward. I think the other aspects that we need to be mindful of right now is that over the years, there's been a lot of process improvement that people have made. Certain practices like just-in-time inventory, or from a compliance procurement team perspective, there was a lot of cost pressures to be faced around how you do vendor selection, how do you find you maintain those budgets year and year after year. So the importance of having a dynamic supply chain seems paramount, more so now than probably ever. So Nick, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on sort of dynamic supply chain, and in particular, what do you think are some of the key things that we should be thinking about with COVID right now causing so much disruption?
Thanks, Charmaine. I think the high-level considerations, and as we spoke about earlier, COVID is one of the most pervasive disruptions we've ever seen, but it's also kind of exposed not only the reactiveness of our BCPs in certain situations in certain industries, it's also demonstrated I guess what we can identify is specific risks. And as you alluded to, with a lot of manufacturing being based in China, and obviously around medicine and certain other things, like a lot of medicines created or manufactured in China and India, which is one of the headlines in the news right now. First and foremost, I think enterprises, BCPs, entailing kind of supply chain vetting processes need to consider concentration risk. And we're going to break this down into two kind of risks that kind of undergird concentration risk, specifically jurisdictional risk and criticality, which we'll get into in a moment. So the concentration risk, the way we should look at this is, obviously, if your suppliers are sitting in a specific jurisdiction, you're obviously going to be overly subject to that jurisdiction to some extent. So as we saw by the U.S.-China trade wars not so long ago, might seem like a distant memory, and more recently by COVID-19, the supply chain concentration risk in one jurisdiction can make your enterprise and your supply lines overly subject to a government and its ability to react to a situation and to effectively provide and maintain a safe, fair, and productive environment for all commercial interests. Now, obviously, with the U.S. and China tariff wars, trade wars, however you want to phrase them, there was some movement with certain enterprises in terms of pivoting away from China to other jurisdictions that would provide seemingly analogous, let's say production centers for cost considerations. But what we need to consider in terms of looking at our supply chain, and ideally looking at our concentration risk first and foremost, is where our suppliers are located and what the implications are of those jurisdictions. First and foremost, for jurisdictional risk, an enterprise should consider the transparency or lack thereof, and how that works in the context of disruption. Specific to COVID, let's say it was obvious early on that there's transparency issues from multiple governments, multiple jurisdictions in terms of response, I guess first and foremost in terms of assessing the threat, in terms of response, in terms of what they're going to tell private enterprises and private citizens to do versus, the public intervention. So we have some, I guess, outdated at this point examples on the slide here of the kind of media conveyance of issues within certain jurisdictions in terms of transparency. So specifically, what should you consider about a jurisdiction when considering your supply chain? So from a high-level consideration, you're starting to review all your suppliers. You've mapped them out. You're starting to understand the jurisdictions that they're in and the concentration risk that comes with that. Within your BCP or supply chain process, ideally you should apply a country risk rating. And what that should really take into consideration is first and foremost the transparency of a government, the robustness of the regulatory regime, as well as any kind of known fraud, corruption, bribery, and or regulatory breaches, which are kind of standard parameters around most compliance programs to some effect, as we discussed earlier. Additional matters you should be considering when you're looking at a specific jurisdiction and its government, which obviously determines the business environment, is are they ensuring that fair and productive business environment for all commercial interests? You should be considering of their social responsibility, looking at human rights and labor, social accountability, IP violations. Now, the third bullet point we went over, the fraud, corruption, bribery, regulatory aspects, obviously are within the kind of regulatory compliance bucket of things, but there's also these extended kind of considerations, especially around human rights and labor and social accountability and intellectual property, to kind of consider what the jurisdictional risk is and how your supply chain will be subject to that, and eventually what that could mean in a kind of mass disruption scenario when you have concentration risk to that jurisdiction. So the summation of your concentration risk with jurisdictional exposure and future mitigation, you need to know where your supply chain starts, you need to know where they're located, what disruptions are most likely to occur within that jurisdiction, whether they're geopolitical, whether they're natural disasters, whether they're, I guess, a biological pandemic or a kind of man-made situation, and how the government's going to react. And lastly, what you can do to activate alternate suppliers at a moment's notice to ensure some sort of continuity. The second aspect of this concentration risk is criticality exposure. Now, this is determining what the most critical aspects of your supply chain are to ensure that reasonable continuity we've spoken about. So this kind of rating should be applied to the links in your supply chain and ideally should take into account the jurisdiction, as we just discussed, the criticality, the financial viability, which we can kind of chalk up to a supplier integrity kind of metric, and if there are available alternate suppliers that you can identify and keep, and obviously build out that tier. So say if the tier 1 supplier of the utmost criticality for a very unique aspect of your supply line, how many other potential alternative suppliers can you build out so you can pivot that piece away? So piecing this all together in terms to mitigate disruption and kind of build out that dynamic supply chain. You should first and foremost kind of assess your supply chain in terms of concentration risk. You should assess jurisdiction and assess criticality. And as you go through criticality and apply ratings to your supply chain on this, you should also assess the criticality based on the commensurate due diligence of that company. And what do I mean by that? You really want to assess the supplier integrity in terms of, does that enterprise have, any kind of legal, commercial, regulatory, reputational issues that could obviously, that go exceed your risk appetite. But keeping this high level, because we'll get into that later, you should really start understanding where the weak links in your supply chain are and where you should really need to pivot into what jurisdictions and how in the event another disruption occurs.
Great, thank you, Nick. You clearly covered a lot of ground there from the concentration risk perspective, which I can only assume from that sort of highest level is probably one of the most important things to be thinking about right now, and breaking that down into those two components around sort of jurisdiction, so the location aspect of it, plus looking at it from the criticality, where is that weak link in your supply chain, as you stated. So I think that's a really sort of key takeaway and consideration for everybody to think about. But if we were to take some of those areas in practice, I guess, Linda, if I was to flip over to you and sort of say off the back of that, if we're looking at concentration risk, we're looking at jurisdiction and criticality, are there perhaps some best practices that you could share with us that Pentair does, or things that you've seen in the industry that means how you have a good and a dynamic supply chain?
Sure. Well, for us, multiple sources of supply whenever necessary, right? I memean, that's key. We want to make sure that if you need motors for your company, that you're not tied to one supplier, one country. That it's just too tough, right? Then there's material management and stocking programs, which need to be defined and maintained based on individual site requirements. In Pentair, we have multiple pump manufacturers, we have multiple water filter manufacturers, and we have multiple gas and oil companies, right? So all of them have different needs. All of them have common supplies, right? But we want to make sure that we keep that, those vendors servicing what those particular plants need based on their requirements. We have to have flexibility to order in our ordering frequency and our volumes that allow us to ramp up or lean out depending on what a particular business is doing. We have to have flexibility in relative to logistics. We need to be able to make sure that we are getting goods either by ocean or by air when needed, or is the rail system working properly? Are the trucks moving? Or is there any chance of strikes anywhere? So we always want to make sure that we keep all of those things in line and that we're watching how close the supplier is to us, what mode of transportation it takes to get it there, and what alternatives there are if that mode of transportation goes down. We also try to make sure that we keep long-term contracts and agreements. We like partners that we have worked with for a long time. It helps us with quality. It helps us with them knowing our product and helping work with new products with us. So we do like long-term contracts. We like timely and accurate communication between our plants and our supply partners, right? So we do a lot of supplier portals where it's real time. They can see into our ERP system to see what we need and when we need it. It's at any given time, right? So it's a forced communication back and forth. And we also have localized manufacturing and insourcing wherever it makes sense. We do own our own foundries in some cases. So it's always where you can get a local partner, it's the best way to go in some situations, depending on price and quality, right? And then, of course, supplier performance feedback. We like to make sure that our suppliers see where we have issues and that they can help us in our manufacturing processes too, because they can teach us what we may not be doing exactly the way that their intended component works. So we do it both ways. But I think for us, that's our best practices.
I really like a lot of those ones that you've mentioned there, Linda. The one that really sort of stands out to me is sort of having that two-way portal to be able to communicate, see what's going on with those different suppliers, those vendors or those freight forwarders. I think that really does speak to what Nick mentioned earlier about sort of those weak links and knowing where you have those weak links in your process. That gives you guys a nice sort of real-time way to sit there and capture it. And obviously that would mean clearly to me that you would have some type of a system or an automation, a streamlining that would help sort of elevate that side to you guys. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. We do. Yep, it is. Everything, we try to keep everything as automated as possible so that it's not a manual, a buyer manually having to email or make a phone call, right? We want to be able to make sure that we are actually using automation to trigger those communications.
And not just from the communication then perspective, what if we were to sort of flip that over and say from sort of a monitoring perspective as well? Obviously, we're in unprecedented times. There's a lot of things that could happen or could go wrong. Is there any sort of data sources or anything else that you're using to help sort of inform that side of it and then couple it with the communication aspect?
Well, because of the way that our processes are actually set up with the portals, they can actually see into our demand. Our suppliers can see into our demand, and we can also see into their shippings, right? So it's one of the key areas that we try and work very closely especially with our major suppliers. As a best practice, it's just what we work with together so that they can see what we're doing and we can see what they're doing.
Great. And does that mean you're screening them, you're doing due diligence on them more frequently than what you might have been doing in the past?
Yes, we do. Yes, of course. All of our suppliers are screened. We use World-Check for all of our screening. That we do the same for our customers, partners, both sides. Customers and vendors are all screened using World-Check. And that's just a matter of best practice so that we are always aware of what their history looks like.
Oh, that's great. I think that's a sort of key piece of information to note is that you're continuing that normal process. So you haven't really broken away from what your normal process and controls are, even in this current environment. But you've got so many good sort of pearls of wisdom there, Linda, to share with everybody. So I'm really just wondering if you could perhaps talk us a little bit more about sort of what are the solutions and things that are out there for, I guess, the here and now. And if we're taking some of those, I guess, lessons learned that we spoke about a little bit earlier today, just in terms of future-proofing, what are some of those things that we really do need to be thinking about as we move forward in the here and now and towards the end of the year, next year, et cetera?
Well, DOJ and OFAC provided us with some real guidance on how to establish an effective compliance program in 2019. We continue to carry that forward, right? At Pentair, we believe that we've done a pretty good job, but there's always room to get better and more efficient and address our risk mitigation. Even with the COVID situation and the pandemic, it is important that you do not shortcut your compliance. You must have the buy-in and a consistent message from the top down, including the board of directors and our ELT, and they do a great job of pushing that to our employees, even in these times, right? It's really that critical. And you have to have an effective program that addresses the real risk based on regions and industry and the relationship. Probably the supplier that's sitting right next door to you in the United States is going to be a very much less risk than someone that you've never met before that's coming from over the ocean. So think about what your risk is based on regions and your industries, and determine what the risk is on that. We use a lot of compliance tools and a lot of risk analysis in our program to make sure that we're only, you can't check everything all the time. So we want to look at the highest risk, and we want to do it based off real facts. You have to be auditable and enforceable, and you need to make sure that you're doing your audits and that you're doing your checks to make sure that the checks and balances are all in place. It doesn't stop just because of COVID, right? Our team is still running their audits on a regular basis. I'm working with controlling on a daily basis to make sure that they're checking to make sure everything has been done right before they set a supplier or they issue a payment to anyone. You have to know your partners, and you have to know how they behave, because you can be held accountable. And you can't manage a program and a corporation our size without automation and software and a great ELT that actually supports us to the nth degree.
I really like that last statement there about your ELT, your extended leadership team, really supporting that. I think that really speaks to, you know, what's on the screen around that governance side of it, is that top-down sort of structure really does play an important side of it. And I think even if we were to tie this back with what you were talking about earlier around sort of FCPA and that regulatory adherence side, you know, the things you're talking about of being able to make sure your board is aware of things, if there are sort of deviations from your policy or your normal practices, that at least you've got that documented. You've got a way to do the audit trail, as you said. You have reasons around why your decisions were made, but to be sorted up to the board as necessary and sort of collated to help with that sort of regulatory side of things as well, but also to keep sort of the top of the house, that leadership team really informed of what's going on, because clearly there's an element of them wanting to know and understand how business operations are being impacted. So I think they're really, really great takeaways for everybody, you know, on the line today and just in general to consider. So thank you. Just from a Refinitiv standpoint, you know, I think a couple of things that would be really helpful for everybody is just to sort of sit there and say, how can Refinitiv help? Refinitiv can really help in two ways. You know, we touched a little bit before in terms of that automation, that sort of screening side and that due diligence side. So there should be no break in what we're normally doing around the general processes, the general controls that operate to support a compliance program, a CIP program, any of those types of procurement, you know, vendor selection programs, doing questionnaires, making sure we understand that. But as it relates back to sort of COVID and some of those key risks that have been highlighted so far around criticality, around jurisdiction as it rolls up under concentration risk, Refinitiv can help in one particular area around that side of it, and that's with one of our products called Country Risk Rating. It is a product that allows you to view transparency across different geopolitical risk factors. It uses a lot of online sources and reputable global organizations to assess overall country. There's about 247 countries and territories included in it. It also aggregates jurisdiction-related country considerations, provides comparative perspectives and analyses, and it also sort of rolls that all up into sort of a master index and provides out a justifiable and sort of transparent model at the very top. Something like that is able to help you understand that concentration risk side of things. The second area where Refinitiv can really help is obviously in the screening. And I know, Linda, you mentioned a little bit earlier when I asked you about screening, how are you guys going about it? You mentioned World-Check. Obviously, World-Check is one of those tools from a data input, a screening, an ongoing screening perspective that you can use to look at those regulatory angles, understanding who your suppliers, your distributors, your resellers are, looking at if there's any particular sanctions out against certain countries, certain individuals or owners, looking at it from that bribery and corruption index. What's happening in the media right now? We saw at the very beginning of the presentation that there's a lot of things floating around in news headlines, in online different forums. What about that adverse media impact? You know, we know that, as Linda said, the bad guys are still out there, so that sort of criminal enterprises, that sort of bribery and corruption side has not disappeared. If there are things that are appearing in news media, you do have to have a way of being able to decipher that to what's credible, what's real, and be able to bring that back into your program and make sure that ongoing screening aspects are working and working as intended. And then I think, you know, the last part is really around sort of enhanced due diligence. That side of things where we're either finding higher risk areas, we're seeing new alternative suppliers needing to be found because you might have products stuck somewhere in Italy and it usually goes out to your Germany plant, or it's in hubs like China where right now planes, freight forwarders, those type of things are not necessarily working. You're looking for an alternative supplier. Making sure that you are doing all of those regular and normal initial due diligence screenings, but you're also doing them for the high-risk parties that you are considering and bringing on board. You know, there is no defense against the COVID side of it when it comes to the regulatory angle for the supply chain. So I think these are very, very, very important things to keep in mind. And one sort of other piece that I will mention out there is, one of the questions that we get asked and have been asked a lot, and most recently in this COVID situation, is there an option to sort of, you know, quickly rank suppliers and to be able to get a starting point without associated risk, given you are looking for perhaps alternative suppliers? And my answer really to that sort of a question is many of the clients that we have been using country risk rankings specifically for that. And it's really helping with their overall due diligence process because they're able to see what's easier for them to do on that concentration, that location, that transparency side of things. So if you think that's something of interest to you, you know, you can certainly take advantage of that service by us allowing you to use a full access free trial for the next month. And that can help you get sort of through some of that journey if that's something you think is relevant and needed to either augment and support what you're already doing, or to sit there and completely add to your overall program. So for anybody that is interested in that, you can actually request that free trial by completing the survey. That's located at the bottom, I think it's the right-hand corner of your screen, if that's of something of interest to you. But sort of obviously, in the interest of sort of moving forward and keeping everybody on track with their lunch break today, I'd really like to just first of all thank Linda Rogers from Pentair and Nick Bellani from Refinitiv for their great insight, for sharing a lot of useful pieces of information that we can all take away from this. And I invite all of our panelists really today to take a look at the questions and answers that have come through from audiences about how we can answer things. So, Karen, can I direct it over to you for some of our audience questions, please?
Thanks, Charlene. Here's everybody. The Q&A box, the top right corner of your screen, or you can click on that little purple Q&A box in the bottom toolbar and submit your questions. We'll get to as many as we can here before the top of the hour. And as Charmaine mentioned, we also have a short survey. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to complete that, the bottom right corner of your screen. We do value your input and really appreciate any responses you can provide to us down there. Let's move on to Q&A. We do have a few questions here. I think the first one, I see, click over here. question for Linda. Linda, question from the audience is, what should a chief risk officer be most concerned with respect to supply chain distribution? In other words, if there was one factor regarding supply chain that you could report to the audit committee, what would that be?
I screened every supplier that I ever engaged with. That I made sure that they were not on a sanctions list or on any other kind of prohibited list. So I would say screening is the one thing that you always want to be able to tell your audit committee that you have done it and you've checked them.
Okay, great. This question could go to probably Linda, but Charmaine, Nick, feel free to pop in if you have any comments. How do you determine how much concentration risk to take where you have a regional, I think it says company leader or cost leader?
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll take that. I guess I'll briefly take it. That's not a decision that a person makes, right? So we at Pentair, we definitely want to make sure that if you see some kind of risk to heavily being populated in one country, you definitely want to consider what does that do to you if you're in a different country, right? If everything is being sourced, let's say from China, and you're in the United States, what happens if something does happen to China? So I think it's a business decision as to how much risk you take.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, it's Charmaine. I agree with what Linda said there. That is not an individual decision. It's certainly something that does need to roll up in terms of what that means for the organization.
Thanks, Charmaine. Linda, again, you're getting all of them. Do you think companies with internal supply chains were too complacent to country risk, specifically China? And do you expect any meaningful relocation of supply chains out of China in response once the coronavirus moderates?
Well, I don't know that it's a bad thing to have suppliers in China, right? I think that wherever in the world that you happen to be located, your supply chain, I think it's just more important that you stay diverse and that you are flexible and that you do at least dual sourcing, if not multi-sourcing of goods. Any region could have some kind of situation that causes them unable to supply. It could be a flood, it could be whatever, right? So we want to make sure that I don't know that it's necessarily going to mean everybody leaves China, right? Because it could be anywhere in the world that something like this happens.
I agree with Linda, actually. It's Charmaine. I'm not sure that, companies are going to become really sort of complacent about country risk. I think if anything, this is going to make them more mindful of where their suppliers are, how many suppliers they have. If there's some countries or some companies that have something like 60,000 suppliers, knowing where they are and knowing what jurisdictions they're in certainly plays an important role in how do they continue business operations, how do they continue on a revenue stream. So there's a lot of sort of angles to what that necessarily means, but I think it's certainly going to make people a lot more aware of some of those sort of best practices that they once thought were best practices that we've now been, proven. We do need to diversify a little bit more. We do need to understand what that country risk is.
Thanks, Charmaine. Appreciate your answer on that. This might be a question for Charmaine, a question based on previous experience with transactions blocking. Can sanctions lists and tools, like World-Check, be updated faster than within 24 hours from the moment the updated list is published by OFAC? It's crucial for non-U.S. banks.
Great question. Clearly the sanctions list is one that we all watch very, very closely, and one cuts out from OFAC. I think you'll find right now in the current environment, everybody is doing their best to get that information updated as soon as possible. I think some companies may be able to do that earlier or in a much shorter time frame than 24 hours, but I think you have to remember what that quality is and where some of that information is being sourced, how that's flowing through into your own internal workflow systems, and then how you're doing that sort of rescreening against that sort of content. So I think it is a possibility, but know that there are a lot of things changing in the background as things are moving in different directions. Let's even take someone like Iran. What's happening out of there? There's different aspects of how timely that's going to be to move through the different facets from one list to another, and then directly into your system to then flag up anything that you may see on any one of your suppliers or your distributors.
Okay. Thanks, Charmaine. I appreciate your answer there. It looks like we've reached the top of the hour, and we're about out of time that we have today. But before we go, I'd like to, again, thank our panelists and thank you, audience, for your time and interest today. We do capture all the questions, so we will try to respond to those people who asked the questions that were unanswered. We'll email you with some answers there. And just another reminder, please, to fill out the survey on the bottom right corner. And finally, another reminder that you will be receiving the recording link as well as a copy of the slides and some other resources. That'll be coming via email either tomorrow or the day after. So again, thank you. Enjoy your day. Enjoy your lunch. This event is now concluded.